All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today for Actors Theater Unscripted. This one is focused on white people talking about white supremacy and becoming anti-racist. And I am joined by an amazing group of people doing that work here in Kentucky. And we really wanted to have this discussion today. I also want to remind everyone that through July, all donations to Unscripted will be split with Roots 101, our African American museum right here on Main Street. So if you are able to support, that'll go to Roots 101 and curator Lamont Collins. So please help if you can. I'm just going to invite everyone, if we could start by a round of introductions. I'm Emily. I'm the artistic producer at Actors Theater. Use they, them pronouns. Let's go to Adrian.
Hey everyone, I'm Adrian Silbernagel. I use he, him pronouns. I am a queer transgender man. I've lived in Kentucky for about 7 years and Louisville for about 3. I'm a writer, coffee shop manager, and a columnist and workshop facilitator at Queer Kentucky.
Josh Poe.
Hey everyone, Josh Poe, use he, him pronouns. I am the co-founder and co-principal investigator at the Root Cause Research Center here in Louisville. I'm a geographer and an urban planner, originally from Eastern Kentucky. We are grounded in data equity, movement science, and abolitionist planning.
Awesome. Chris.
Hello, it's really nice to be here with you all. And so I work with white community groups to help support white people to rise up for racial justice as part of our own struggle for collective liberation. And been living here in Louisville for the past 4 years with my kids and being a part of this incredible multi-generational, multiracial community for justice here.
Thanks, Chris. Talleri.
Hi, everyone. I am Talleri Mccrea. I am a teaching artist. I've been living in Louisville for 9.5 years now. I work primarily as a theater teaching artist. I'm also an access, inclusion, and education consultant, and I work with an organization called National Disability Theater as well.
Jess.
Hi, all. My name is Jessica Reese. I use she, her pronouns. I'm part of Louisville Showing Up for Racial Justice, and I've lived in Louisville about 5 years. I'm from East Tennessee originally.
Awesome. Andrew.
Hey there, I'm Andrew. I've also been in Louisville about 5 years. Done a lot of work with Louisville Showing Up for Racial Justice and worked as a regional organizer for the National Surge organization for Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia. I'm also a local actor. And was teacher, but I'm taking a year off because I have 10-week-old twins at home. So I'm going to be full-time parent for at least a year.
Wonderful. Josh Hart.
Hey, what's up, everybody? I have been born and raised in Louisville, so I've been around for about 32 years until very recently. I pastor 2 churches, one in Louisville and one in South Chicago. So as of right now, I currently live in Chicago and travel back and forth. But I love Louisville. I love what it stands for. I love what it represents, and I love what it can be. So I'm excited to be in this conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. We know white silence is one of the many barriers that white people have to doing this work. So having conversations like this is part of that. And ultimately, we know that white supremacy is a white issue. It is in the name. And I wanted to share a quote. We are also started a podcast called Borrowed Wisdom. Josh Poe is actually the first guest on that. So if you can listen to that. And we had a guest, Dr. David Anderson Hooker. And he said, white supremacy is redundant. Whiteness is a political space, a social construct. It's a fiction that has been infused in all of our meaning making in a way that already provides supremacy, privilege, and superiority. Whiteness is the social construction, the fiction, it exists. And so how do we find our way forward? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And I wanted to start with just, how did you start? Was there a moment of clarity that propelled how you came to this work? I don't know who wants to start.
Adrian, go for it.
Sure. Hey, so I'm Adrian again. Yeah, so thank you, Emily, for this great starting question. I think that white people, myself included, can sometimes have a hard time acknowledging the ways in which in our past we have been ignorant and complicit in racism and systemic racism. So it's easy to like omit that part of our story or kind of gloss over it or just be like, I've always been super anti-racist, right? But I think it's important for us to acknowledge that that is not the case. One, because it helps normalize accountability on the part of white people, and two, because it helps normalize the idea that it's better late than never. It's better to have been complicit and then to have come around to realize the damage you were doing in doing so. So anyway, I just wanted to say thank you starting out for that great question. So I grew up in North Dakota, a very, very, very white state. The small town that I grew up in, according to the 2010 census, had a population that was made up of about 0.1% Black people. So I think there was like one Black person living in the town in 2010. I went to predominantly white schools, white colleges. I did grad school in Lubbock, Texas, where I did encounter diversity, but more in the sense of like brown folks, like the larger Latino population there. And then I moved to Kentucky, first Lexington. And when I moved to Lexington, I got out of academia. I left the academic track and started working in the service industry. And by virtue of that, my circles kind of started to expand and include more Black and brown people, some activists. And that's when I think my eyes really started to open, and I started to pay attention and be more tuned into issues of systemic racism and white supremacy. This was like right before the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson. And so that was also pretty eye-opening for me. But I think that there were two main things that really propelled me forward on these issues. And one, kind of ironically enough, was my gender transition. So I came out as transgender and began transitioning about 5 years ago. And in doing that, a lot of my kind of like naivety about the world was sort of shattered as I became more aware and like personally encountered and was affected by systemic oppression towards trans people, right? Whether that be housing or job discrimination, healthcare discrimination, all of these things. And so like that started to open my eyes in a very like personal way. And then moving to Louisville, where I met a lot more Black folks and Black trans folks whose identity at the intersection of, Black identity and trans identity, were truly, their stories and their experiences in developing relationships with these folks is really kind of what made me realize that, there's a huge problem out here, and it's not going to fix itself. Like if we don't use our power and privilege in whatever ways that we can to address these issues, they're never going to change, and it's just going to keep getting worse. So that's kind of my story in brief.
Thank you for sharing that. Jess, did you have your mute off before?
Yeah, classic Zoom issues. Well, Adrian, I'm glad that you brought up the murder of Michael Brown, because that was also a big turning point for me. I was able to sort of skate by on a beautiful ice skating rink of white privilege for, most of my life. And then to be like in my mid-20s around the time that Michael Brown was murdered, and Eric Garner also around the same time. That was a moment when I really started to learn more about policing and prisons and mass incarceration and just all of these issues that I had not really had personal experience with, and certainly didn't have a lot of awareness of. But it's interesting, right? Because it's like, oh, right, I became aware of a lot of things, but then what is the moment where that awareness turns into action, especially sustained action? And I think that took me a lot longer. And I was thinking of sort of moments. And one moment for me was somebody from LSurge like took me out to coffee and talked to me about some of the campaigns that LSurge was working on at that time. And the most important thing is they gave me something to do. They gave me something to do right away. And so there was a way for me to sort of share my story and how I'd become aware of my own whiteness and talking about growing up in a rural area. But then there was immediately an opportunity to do something with that. And so I sort of lift that up as a moment of, that's sort of how organizing works in some ways. It's just one conversation at a time, one moment at a time. And that was like a powerful turning point for me. And I'm really grateful to Carla Wallace, who's the person that took me up and thought it was worth their time to talk to me.
Thank
I'll
you.
share.
Please,
real
Andrew.
quick. I was also snatched up by a Carla Wallace around 2015. I found my way to racial justice through environmental activism. I was and have since graduated with a degree in geography with an emphasis in environmental analysis. And so in like 2015 or 16, there was this big push. Some of you may all remember that a company wanted to build a agricultural waste biodigester in West Louisville. And it ended up becoming this huge clash between Black environmental activists who said, we actually don't want it and we have the right to dictate what goes into our communities, versus on this other side, white environmentalists being really patronizing and saying, you just don't understand the technology, we need this. And so I was somewhere in the middle of all of that when LSurge kind of showed up into that conversation. And that was the first time I was like, wow, maybe, yeah, like I'm really passionate about the earth not dying, but maybe one of the reasons we justify the killing and slow burning of the earth is through the same mechanisms that justify white supremacy and racism. And like all those connections started like going together and my head was exploding. And that's when Carla Wallace, she's like, hey, why don't we grab coffee? And in 2015, I did an internship with Louisville Surge, and that's kind of how I got pulled in. Again, a one-on-one conversation with another white person who said, I see that you're feeling a certain way. Let's talk through some of what you're feeling. That's how I got in.
I'll go next. My journey has been probably one that's just been less of a defining moment and more of a evolving realization over time. I have always been the church that I have and my grandfather planted is in the West End. So we have always kind of been engaged in that community. But that for me became almost a bubble in itself because I kind of built this idea that everybody embraced other cultures the same way that I did. And I further began to realize, and that's why I'm glad even in the title of this, anti-racist is the language that we use, because I realized that even in my own upbringing, I was raised to not be racist, but not necessarily be anti-racist. And so I think that has started some conversations even with how I want to raise my children, that it's not enough to just not deal or not have the racism in yourself as it is to confront racism head on. That is your responsibility for just basic human rights to confront the idea of racism boldly. So if it's it's the classic Black friend conversation. I have Black friends, so it doesn't apply to me, and it's just the ignorance of that we have to go a further step to where I'm at now having conversations with my children, with my daughter, where if they see some of these things that are happening to their friends, it's not enough to just console your friends. At that point, your responsibility is to confront the individual that is doing what they're doing to them. So I think it's been just an expansion really over time of what it is. I really started digging into the information of it and studying the systems and statistics and stuff around the Philando Castile time. And that was one that really, really triggered me And so it's a conversation that I think is so necessary. I'm glad we're having it. A lot of my evolution per se has been just in conversation with Black people. I think sometimes white people need to be okay getting information from the culture that is being oppressed and maybe not try to get so many answers from our own people. And so I learned a lot just in conversations and expanding that idea that I had built with friends and relationships with Black individuals.
Okay, thanks, Josh. Anyone else sort of want to share sort of what launched them into this work before we go to some more questions?
Yeah, I can go.
Thanks, Joshua.
You know, I'm from Eastern Kentucky and grew up in really extreme poverty, you know, in that space. And so I kind of was radicalized really early. And I ended up moving to Seattle in the late 90s. And I got involved in movement work, but I was coming from a place of a really extreme shame and extreme rage, you know, about where I was from. And so I had a really strong class analysis, but I was really lacking a grounding political analysis. You know, I just wanted to get involved in something. And so Seattle was a good place to be during that time because you had anarchist bookstores, you had Marxist Leninist bookstores, you had radical queer spaces, you had radical Black spaces. So it was a good place to kind of learn and develop a really strong political analysis. And at that time, there was a strong anti-gentrification movement in the city that really kind of like, you know, combined the best elements of intersectionality and kind of the real meaning of intersectionality at that time. And so the WTO protest happened then, and I kind of became disillusioned with the left during that time, because, you know, if you read about Seattle during that time, it's sort of celebrated that there was this strong solidarity between what they called the Teamsters and the Turtles, right? The Teamsters and the Turtles hooked up. And what that means is that the environmental movement hooked up with the labor movement. And that's really celebrated. And I take a lot of heat for saying this, but I didn't see that as a great win, because essentially what you had were, you know, white middle-class environmentalists forming alliances with white middle-class labor leaders. And so, you know, and so I didn't see it as this, you know, I didn't see it as anything crossing this great divide. Meanwhile, you had, you know, young Black men being murdered in the central area where I lived while the neighborhood was being gentrified. And none of the middle-class white people in those spaces showed up at those protests. So I really realized, like, there's a real problem with the left, and there's a real problem with the way we're analyzing you know, class within these dynamics. And there's also a real problem with the way the nonprofit industrial complex shows up in those spaces. And so around that time I moved to Cincinnati, I moved back to Kentucky, and I lived in Cincinnati for a little while. And I became really aware of the gentrification over the Rhine. And so one of my closest friends named Timothy Blair was actually murdered by the police. And the same police officer that murdered Timothy Blair, or that shot Timothy Blair, he wasn't murdered, he was paralyzed, but shot Timothy Blair, later murdered Timothy Thomas, which kind of helped kick off the riots in Over the Rhine at that time. And so I kind of saw the riots as an issue around redevelopment and around gentrification. So a lot of my work leading into radical geography was really focused on housing issues, gentrification, and I really came to see this and reading people like Cedric Robinson. So I really came to sort of study and try to understand racial capitalism. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I came initially from a real anti-capitalist place, and through you know, really studying, you know, having a strong material analysis. Like, this is not a psychological issue. Like, I never want to be going and trying to train white middle class people to not be racist. That's just not work I'm interested in at all. Like, if the work isn't about redistributing material resources, you know, it doesn't seem to be as effective for me. So, you know, really trying to explain racial capitalism, I realized like we can't do anti-capitalist work unless it's also anti-racist, and that those two are so intricately linked that you can't separate them. And so, you know, my work on redlining and the work that we're doing now, it's you know, it's anti-racist, but it's also anti-capitalist, really based around the idea that you go to where you go to the pain points, right? And so the idea is, like, if we can really if we can really attack these systems that are exploiting and extracting wealth from Black people, we can all get free, right? My people in Eastern Kentucky can get free. We can really, if we can destroy racial capitalism, we can live in a better society for everyone.
Yes. Yes. So I can jump in here and then also try to get to this one of these questions here in the chat, if that works. So I came from a mostly working class family and mostly working class communities, and really saw the ways that white supremacy was devastating in white working class communities to turn class anger and class pain into white supremacist anger and resentment towards people of color. And I saw that over and over and over again. But thankfully, my mom would stand up and say, no, the racism in our family is not right. And she talked to me about Cesar Chavez. She talked to me about people who are working for justice. And that opened up opportunities for me to get involved with social justice activism. But then the Rodney King verdict in Los Angeles in the early 90s and the mass uprising of, that launched the slogan, no justice, no peace around the world, seeing that mass uprising, I realized that it wasn't just about being against the Klan and the neo-Nazis, which is important, that white supremacy was fundamental to how capitalism and economic inequality and political inequality operate, and that anti-Black racism is so deep into the structures of the society. But what happened in that moment of mass rebellion was conversations about race started happening amongst our friends. And so people of color who had not talked openly with white people in our group about race started speaking about their experiences. And my friend Terrence, 18-year-old African-American young man, started talking to me about the ways that white supremacy is a nightmare in his life. But what he said was that white supremacy is also a nightmare in your life and you don't even know it. That white supremacy raises you to be racially illiterate, so you don't understand the history of how race has shaped capitalism. You don't understand how the history of race has shaped democracy. And also, white supremacy malnourishes white people by cutting white people off from the legacies of liberation struggle, Black freedom struggle, struggles in communities of color, as well as the histories of white anti-racist struggle. And so for me, that was this real, it's not just about anti-racism for white people, but anti-racism as opening up the door to powerful, deep legacy and value of liberation to connect our hearts and our souls and our families and our communities to, and that white supremacy is a devastating attack on white communities to turn us into machines for capitalism and weapons against communities of color. And so for me, having those conversations, and then soon after, organizers of color over and over and over again, this goes to this question here about, is white supremacy and racism a white issue and white people working on it? Over and over and over again, doing multiracial work, organizers of color saying, we need to have multiracial, Black-led, Indigenous-led, multiracial movements to transform and bring down these systems of oppression and build up a multiracial democracy and economic justice. And we need white anti-racist leaders who are deeply organizing in white communities to move white people into justice work with anti-racism at the heart. And that it's not about white people ending white supremacy, because that's not how it's going to happen, but multiracial movements that have significant bases of support in white working class and poor communities, white middle class, cross class around white communities, in particular with working class white communities, to join together to bring down these systems. And so not that white people, it's a white issue, but that there's an opportunity and responsibility for white people to do liberatory organize. So I don't organize in white communities from a place of white people, you're racist, you've got white privilege. I operate from a place of, we need to end these systems that are a death culture in communities of color, but also turn white people into tools and machines and dehumanize our souls to turn us against people of color. And that we need to fight back for economic justice and multiracial democracy.
Thank you, Chris. Talleri, do you want to jump in there?
Sure. I have come to this work in a couple of different ways. I was raised in Michigan and then also lived in California in mostly upper middle class and upper class white communities. And I have a disability. And when I went to college, I studied theater, again, in a predominantly white program. But what was unique about my identity was that I had a disability, right? And so I also went on to study in graduate school and studied both theater and education in those spaces. And about 10 years ago, I moved to Louisville and was working in theater around town. And I really became interested in what accessibility and inclusion looked like in arts communities. And I particularly was and still am really interested in the practical tools that we have to transform spaces and make them more accessible. So when I sit down as an access consultant, whether I'm talking with a theater company or a museum or another community-based organization, even if they're not in the arts, I'm really big on saying, okay, what are the practical tools that you can use today to make your space more accessible to people that need different things, right? And I have found that some of the tools to make spaces more accessible are different forms of communication, different modes for choices and options, and then creativity, which is one of my favorite pieces of that. I think where I really started to think about how accessibility for the disabled community and accessibility for the Black, Brown, any other community, right, that we're really looking at, those, I've always thought about the intersections of not always, that's a lie. Since I started thinking about accessibility, I've thought about how making a space accessible for one group is also a great thing for another group, right? So in the disability community, we call this the curb cut effect. When you have a curb cut that lets a wheelchair get down off the sidewalk into the street and back up again, it's also useful for mothers with young children or vendors that use food carts or all kinds of things. So I have always been really excited by the potential of that intersectionality. But I think this moment in time in the world with two things that are affecting us right now, right? The COVID-19 and all of the ways in which our healthcare system has been really laid bare for the majority of our citizens in a way that hasn't happened in my lifetime, at least in how I've thought about healthcare on a large scale. And then also, obviously, all of the issues around Black Lives Matter and racial justice and the justice that we're looking for Black and Brown and Indigenous communities. That has really made me think about accessibility in a new way. And I'll give you one example. As a teacher, we talk about designing a space universally, right? Which means making a space that is as accessible as possible to anyone that uses that space. And honestly, in the past, when I was working inside these relatively hierarchical systems that were really just had this, again, a kind of undercurrent, unspoken feeling of, or was based on white supremacy, I would always say, universal design is a great ideal to be working towards, but what you really also have to have in your pocket are these tools for accessibility, right? To like take the system you're already working in and tweak it so that you've got tools you can use immediately. And one thing that I'm really excited about in this particular moment in our country and in the world is that we are at a unique time and place where we can actually start from that universal design. To say we don't have to accept that we have to learn how to maneuver within an existing system. We're in a space where we can actually redesign the system. And by we, I don't mean me, because I'm most familiar with the structures and supports and have benefited from the hierarchies that have existed. So we as a global community can take a step and say, what does school, for example, look like in the future if we are communicating with people in ways that are effective, if we are giving people honest and true choices where they're making the best decisions for what works for them, and we're using creativity to make that brand new system happen.
Thank you, Talleri. Yeah, I want to go back to what Jen Marie shared, that Chris also was speaking about, and also North Miller gave an answer in their chat. But this idea of sort of, there feels like a thin line between the term white savior, which maybe someone could share a little bit more about, and doing nothing. And so how do you, turn the impulse, which a lot of white people are having for the first time, or having new awareness in this moment, how do you turn that impulse to do something into useful and consistent work?
I find, so I really admire Miriam Cabo, who's a organizer, prison industrial complex abolitionist, just a terrific writer, thinker. She has shared these 4 questions that really help her when she's trying to figure out how to respond to some kind of injustice. And so I want to share those because I think they sort of get at how do you do this stuff without being any kind of a savior who can sort of swoop in and save the day. That's not real. So the questions she asks herself are, what resources exist so I can better educate myself? So that's the first one. The second one is who's already doing work around this injustice, which I find really useful, because chances are if I'm seeing the injustice, it already existed a long time ago and I need to catch up and get with the program. The third question is, do I have the capacity to offer concrete support to the people who are already doing this work, right? And then the last question is, how can I be constructive in this moment? And so I share those if they're helpful. I find them very practical. So I just kind of throw them out there.
Thank you, Jessica. Just to build on what you were saying a little bit, I love those 4 questions, and I would love to, if you would be able to send me those or share them somehow with the group. I think those could be really useful in the future too. As far as offering constructive or concrete support without pretending like you can do anything to swoop in as a savior of some sort, because that is certainly not our role. I like to try to think about before I go into a space that is not my space, a space that I'm visiting, perhaps a Black Lives Matter protest or organizing meeting or something like that. What is my role here? And I don't necessarily get to decide what my role is there. I'm going in there to be told what my role is by the people who are leading or organizing the event, and to be told, hey, this is where we need you. We need you marching. We need you handing out supplies. If it's an organizing meeting, I'm not going to be the one there calling the shots. I'm going to be the one taking direction or being assigned a task. If I'm organizing with other white people, however, if it's say a largely white company, and you are trying to organize with your colleagues or coworkers to try to bring out anti-racist initiatives, I mean that's a slightly different scenario where you as a white person are doing white people's work to end the racism in this white establishment, but hopefully you're doing it in a way that is not speaking over or speaking for Black people. You're doing your research, you're listening, you're hearing the experiences or listening to, people who've been in similar situations and how they've been affected. You're taking the advice of the Black people without burdening them and expecting them to do the emotional labor to tell you what to do. So that's a fine line too when it comes to when do you ask for advice or ask for direction or instruction from Black people in the movement who are doing, movement building work, because they're busy. They've got shit to do. And we are the ones that need to catch up and pay attention and figure out, where we can be best put to use. So I think, just kind of that mindfulness when going into a space or taking on an initiative or trying to contribute in some way, recognizing that you're there to support. If you're at a protest, you're not leading the march, you're not leading the chant, right? You're there to lag behind and follow and be there in solidarity until the police approach. And then you get to the front where your white body can be a barrier between, the Black bodies and the police. So a lot of it is just listening and learning and, going out of your way to, I don't want to say going out of your way, but being proactive about learning what you need to do to be effective in those spaces, you know, not expecting somebody to spoon feed it to you. Like, the internet exists for a reason, trainings exist for a reason, direct action trainings, police de-escalation trainings. These are not hard to find. They're right here in town. And so like, you can access these resources if you look for them. And that's where you will learn like the way that you can be effective without pretending to be a white savior, stepping on toes, or trying to recreate the wheel, which Black people already know, you know, what they need to do to achieve their liberation.
Yeah, those are amazing points. I'd love to just add, I mean, we could probably really stop there between those two, but I'd love to add, I think that we have to deal with sometimes the privilege in ourselves and resolve the ability to work and celebrate a win that we don't necessarily have to take credit for. And I think the ability to do that and get behind organizations. I'll go again to the point of a lot of my learning coming from talking to the people that are sitting in those seats. I think those people that should be the ones that get the credit for the win, even if we are helping with the work. The other thing that I would say as far as the white savior thing, at least in my experience, I don't know that you should allow that narrative to make you so fearful that it paralyzes your activity. And I think sometimes those terms cause us to kind of freeze up and not do anything because we don't want to mess up. So really, I would just ultimately say, don't be afraid to mess up, and be willing to be confronted per se. If you do cross a line, anytime that I have maybe pushed it a little bit too far, it's been easy conversations because the people that I'm working with understand my heart. They understand what I'm trying to do, and my receptivity to adjust in those moments give me the ability to continue to want to work. And we're gonna make mistakes. We're gonna go too far. There's gonna be times we don't do enough, and we have to be willing to learn through those moments. Obviously, for lack of better words, my area of expertise is more in the church. And there is, as far as gathering white people, I don't have a ton of success gathering the white church crowd. And I'll be honest, my congregations were all very, very diverse, about 50-50 as far as African-American and Caucasian, until when the Philando Castile thing came out. Some of my rhetoric started going in the direction of statistics. And at that point, a lot of the crowd that basically didn't want to hear that left and went to a space that would embrace them, and the ability to mask it. So the church is not separate from this fight and even the uncomfortable conversations that need to be had. And I think we've got to be willing to, like I said, mess it up along the way and still pick up and keep going and try again tomorrow.
Thank you, Josh. Would those of you who've been involved in Surge and L-Surge maybe talk a little bit more about that work? And also, Josh Poe, if we could also talk a little bit more about root cause, because I know those are also ways for people to be involved. Those are needs that we have here in our community, very actionable steps within those organizations. Andrew, could I go to you to start?
Sure. So the quick backstory of Surge showing up for racial justice was started by a handful of folks after the election of Barack Obama. We entered into this time where there was a lot of rhetoric saying, "Oh, we've got a Black president, we've solved racism, it's over, look what we did." And when in actuality, Jay, I know you're talking a lot about stats, we saw hate crimes rise to a level they'd not been at in decades, against people of color across, the whole spectrum, but specifically targeting Black folks. And so a group of leaders, Carla Wallace was a local person, I think Pam McMichaels, who was at the Highlander Center at that time, I can't remember all the names, got together with folks of color and said, what what do we do? This is happening in white communities. This is clearly something that white folks have to be involved in. And there's also this huge legacy of activists of color from the entirety, the whole duration of people of color who've been fighting for better for our country in the hundreds of years this country has existed, who have always said that there is something that white folks have to be doing. So Surge was started to kind of stay true to that ask from people of color to white folks to go and organize our own as part of a multiracial collective working toward mutual liberation. So Surge sprang up out of that. I think there are chapters in every state, and the organizing principle really is that there is a very intentional role that white people need to play in recruiting other white people for the movement. And what that really means to me, there's a lot that Surge does. I think what that means to me is, I think as white folks, we get stuck in this place where we want to become experts on racism and activism before we jump in. It feels like a very academic thing we want to tackle. We want to get all the books, all the information, all the documentaries, and we're going to learn it all. And then once we're perfect anti-racists, we're going to jump in and we're just going to like, woo, yeah, we're going to solve it all. And what ends up happening is you become frustrated. The steam of the moment, dies down. And so where I think Surge plays a really interesting role is it helps facilitate this ongoing dialogue. So what happens in the fall, let's say Biden's elected, which not my first, let's say Trump's gone, so that pressure's out of here. But like stuff is still shitty, but like we're not in this exact hot, intense moment we've been in the summer with Black Lives Matter activism. And then all this fizzle comes down. The excitement's gone. The sexy, I don't mean, there's like a sort of energy around protesting in the street. What happens when all that's gone? And what happens when we're just white folks sitting in our suburban houses? So I think Surge is a great tool to help white folks continue to engage and build some sort of power to be able to show up in those moments where we're really being called on to be activated for that multiracial collective action. That felt like a lot. I'm sorry,
Can I throw a couple of actions or sort of action steps people can take this week and next? And then I want to make sure Josh gets a lot of time to talk about root cause. So just to say, I think LSurge right now is trying to offer things where you can show up in person, but also keep in mind that a lot of people are still needing to shelter in place for health reasons, age concerns, family stuff, all kinds of things. So I'm going to give sort of two buckets. And you can find more information about this stuff. Best place to go is actually Surge Louisville's Facebook page. You're already on Facebook, so you can just cruise on over. There's a couple of skill building sessions coming up next Thursday. One of them is being led by Sonia DeVries about how to have tough conversations about race. And then the other one is some direct action training that we've been doing weekly and a little bit bi-weekly. Things like de-escalation, some other stuff, legal observation, just some different ways so people can kind of show up in the streets with a little more knowledge and a little bit more ability to be acting in accountability, I would say. So that's sort of some in-person stuff. And then also, there is just a lot of phone actions you can take. So Surge has been doing national phone banking every Thursday for the last couple of months around different electoral issues, talking to predominantly white voters about racial justice, both around some really key primary elections and also looking ahead to the fall. So it's just this ongoing thousands of phone calls every week, phone banking, that I think is going to have a long-term impact on the electorate. So I would really encourage folks to get involved in that. The training's provided. It's every Thursday, 6 to 9 p.m. Eastern time. They give you everything you need, and you can do it from home. So I would say go for that. And then we also regularly put out calls to push elected officials on various issues and try to do that in accountability with the asks that are coming from other local organizations. I know another question we got in the chat was about how we're personally supporting Black Lives Matter. So I just definitely want to give a shout out to anybody who can follow BL in Louisville on social media, on Twitter, and keep an eye out for phone apps. They regularly post phone numbers, scripts, everything you need to just sort of like make some pushes. And you can do that stuff while, you know, you're still needing to shelter in place because of COVID. So I hope that's helpful. It's kind of a lot, but just a couple of examples of things you can do in the next week or two.
Thank you, Jess, for sharing those. Josh, what is currently happening with Root Cause, and where are the actionable steps or even resources to begin to understanding some of that redlining, plantation capitalism, all of that work that you're involved with?
Well, Root Cause Research Center started in January when myself and Jessica Bellamy decided to launch it. Around the idea that academia and institutions don't or should not control the means of production for knowledge and data, that knowledge and data should be democratized and actually owned and controlled by the communities that it's typically extracted from. And so as long as we have knowledge and data produced by major institutions like academia and like nonprofits, we're going to have white supremacist pro-capitalist narratives. And so communities lack resources to make decisions about what's happening. And so we were heavily influenced by organizations like our data bodies out of North Carolina. I'm particularly really influenced by the work by people like Ananya Roy in Los Angeles, Stop LAPD Spying, and Anti-Eviction Mapping Project on the West Coast. So part of this, our idea was that we bring that sort of radical spirit of work in Oakland and LA to the South. We really believe in the South. You know, I believe, you know, coming from Appalachia, that I do racial capitalist work and abolitionist work because of where I'm from and not in spite of it. And there again, I feel like Appalachians we haven't really been able to tell our own stories. People tell stories about us. And much like Black communities, those stories have serious political motivations. So we really believe in the power of digital organizing and data storytelling. And so essentially organizing is our theory of change. We believe like the most anti-racist thing you can engage in is either labor organizing or tenant organizing. And so our job is then to provide resources to those to the movement-based work, and we've provided resources to a couple we provided resources to people working at the grassroots level, and we provided resources to some direct actions that have occurred locally. So we decided in January that gentrification was going to be a huge focus of our work, and really trying to explain racial capitalism functionality here in the city of Louisville, particularly, and really trying to explain how different sectors of society function in that space. So how nonprofits function within gentrification, how police function within gentrification, how surveillance functions. So we launched a blog series based around that. We did a study in Russell where we mapped land ownership. Then that was influenced by a study of Appalachia that was done in the 80s, which showed that these are essentially occupied territories, right? There are places where rent is extracted for wealth for someone else. So, you know, only 18% of the land in Russell is actually owned by people who live there. And we work primarily with people who are impacted by these systems and help train them for organizing and for research. We believe everyone has the capacity for research. We believe that impacted people already do research on a daily basis. We just don't call it that. And so we believe that there are multiple sources of data that institutions don't control. So memory is a source of data. People's experiences are a source of data. And essentially, you know, based around the idea that the people who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution, and that data can be not a tool of empowerment, because that's sort of an oppressive word, but at least to embolden people as an organizing mechanism.
Thank you. We also have a question that came in about who could white people follow to better understand the Black experience in our country? And of course, the Black experience is not a monolith, but if there are resources that have been helpful to you all, or things that we could point to, or people who are active in our community, Black leaders doing this work here, if anyone wanted to share that.
This is Talleri. I'm going to be a theater nerd for a second. There is a great example of kind of centering BIPOC experience in inclusive theater that comes out of the San Francisco Bay Area, Berkeley area. They're called Sins Invalid, and they do their work is performance work, but it's also community connected advocatism, activism and advocacy. They have written a lot about what disability justice looks like in their practice and how they have really centered the experiences of disabled people who are BIPOC and also queer in this, in I think a really accessible way. And it's been one of the things that they are doing right now during this time is just giving a lot of different tips for self-love and self-care in a way that spans both kind of art and activism together.
I would say for our organizations, we partnered with Grassroots Law, which was also the group of lawyers that were in Louisville last night working to get the protesters out of jail. But if it's simply following to better understand Black experience, which I think the question was, if you aren't already following Sean King, who is a part of the Grassroots Law group, he's consistently putting out content just for awareness sake. And I think a lot of times it's just getting people aware that this is not, George Floyd was not a random incident. Breonna Taylor is not a random incident. This stuff happens all the time. We just don't talk about it until it's a trend or until it's a hashtag. And so for me, I always point people for consistency to Sean King for consistent presentation of what the Black conversation is right now.
I'll jump in here if that's all right.
Yeah.
Adrian here. So as far as folks that white people could follow to better understand Black experience in our country, there are so many amazing community leaders in Louisville and organizers, Black women, Black femmes, Black queer people just doing incredible organizing work right now. I hesitate to say their names because these are also the individuals that are being most targeted at this time by the police. And, you know, both organizers and independent reporters or live streamers have been targeted in recent weeks during the protests and such. So, but there are also other names. Hannah Drake is a local poet, writer, activist, and she's incredible. She is someone I cannot recommend enough as someone to follow and just learn about not just issues of racial injustice, but sexism, intersectionality, queer and transphobia, things like that. She's just an incredible spokesperson, just doing all kinds of amazing work. So Hannah Drake. And also on the subject of intersectionality, because I believe that, you know, as a lot of people here have said, there's no justice for some of us without justice for all of us. And I think that there is a tendency for the media to kind of like forget to mention or omit or brush under the rug, for example, trans Black women who've been murdered by the police or in other acts of hate crime. And so I think that looking at all of these issues through sort of a intersectional lens or a Black queer feminist lens is always a great idea and a good way to kind of gain an understanding of how all of these issues intersect and perpetuate each other. And so there's one book that I'm actually reading right now that was recommended to me by a Black femme non-binary friend of mine. And it's by Charlene Carruthers. And the book is called Unapologetic. And it's basically a discussion of, you know, movement building and organizing through a Black queer feminist lens. And it's really incredible. So if you're looking for an understanding of these issues that takes into account intersectionality, I recommend Unapologetic by Charlene Carruthers.
And also just to jump in on I think it's crucial that we're, like learning and studying and getting these different perspectives. And we're living in historic times where it's what Jess said before about there's the conversation, but then there's the action. The actions we take now in mass movement, Black-led times, we have seen unbelievable changes and victories, whether it's people bringing down monuments all over the world of slavers and racist statues, whether it's NASCAR and the Confederate flag, whether it's school districts around the country defunding the police from their schools. There's been unbelievable, and it's on and on and on, the list of things that have been won that people have been working on and organizing around for, in some cases, decades or years. So right now, the phone call you make this week has more impact than the phone call you make in downtimes. And that's not to say that we don't do the work and what I mean by downtimes is when there isn't a mass movement that's setting the national agenda around defund the police, around institutional racism, that is shifting the political terrain of this country to the left. And so what we do in these times in terms of protests, phone calls, fundraising, having conversations with people, and not conversations to raise awareness, but I would say in particular to focus on conversations that help move us into action. Because right now, so for example, rather than having 100 conversations with the most racist person in my family, my focus was changing the legislation and elected officials in the state that I live in so that the racist person in my family, their policies are no longer governing us in the state. And so yes, engage, but try to organize and build political power to be able to transform. We need legislation change, policy change. We got elected officials. So trying to do as much as we can in these times has monumental impacts. It's also a liquefied time where people's long-time held positions that they feel are solid are changing. So somebody could be like everyone's fine, I'm not racist, be kind to everybody. That could be them 2 weeks ago. And then they start getting involved and seeing what's happening. And next thing you know, they're saying like, we need to end institutional white supremacy and we need to build a movement to win. So people can have profound changes in their hearts, in their minds, and be radicalized and activated in these times. So yes, read. Yes, look to the things where we can get perspective. But I would say crucially in these times is to experience and participate, not thinking you have to get it all right, like was said earlier, but actively participate in these historic mass movement times led by the movement for Black Lives.
Well said, Chris. I think it is a yes and I think that, let me go to this question. I know we're coming to our end, so let's do two more. I think that all goes alongside with many things we've touched on of like our desire often as white people to be good, to get it right, and to not have that stop us from taking action. And so how do we, as we're taking action, how do we evaluate and adjust as we go and learn versus sort of stop and learn and then move? So how do you all sort of like sustain, adjust, and like keep doing this work?
I'll jump in here. I think a lot of it has to do with the political analysis that you developed, and so we're all rooted in that political analysis. And then once you kind of develop that political analysis and develop your values and beliefs, you kind of develop who you're in solidarity with, and that's why I think there's so much hope of working with poor white people, because poor white people actually share a material reality with Black communities that could actually foster solidarity. And so, if we look at the entire history of capitalism, as Chris kind of alluded to, that's the entire history of capitalism is about using race, and really the history of our country. And so many of our policies are really about using race to crush that sort of labor solidarity. And so I don't have a lot of hope that sort of middle-class white liberals will ever develop that. I believe that a lot of the sort of the new liberal wokeism that we have is really performative and really kind of based in the nonprofit sector. And so a lot of white liberals have the privilege of not being racist because the police are basically hired to be racist for them. And so they go to liberal arts colleges and they're sort of trained to know what to say, right? And so a lot of the sort of the new wokeism that comes out of that is really, for me, really based in this sort of like shaming other white people that I'm more woke than you are. And it really doesn't develop any sort of solidarity or any sort of collective power. And so one of the things that really discouraged me early in my career, and this is the best advice I can give anyone, is the nonprofit industrial complex. Working in nonprofits just kind of, it just destroyed my spirit, and it made me so disillusioned. And so, within capitalism, we can't have 100%, we can't have 100% employment, right? So not everybody can have a job. And so people who aren't employed, they have to find other means to survive, and we call those things illegal. And, the reason we have police, one of the reasons we have prisons and police is to manage that surplus population. And that's largely also the reasons we have nonprofits, right? And so a lot of I believe that one of the largest barriers that we have right now to doing any sort of true organizing or really any liberatory work is the nonprofit industrial complex and the way philanthropy functions to sort of capture movements and co-op movements. And so if you really want to decide, like, if your nonprofit is progressive, try to start a union there, right? And you're going to find out just how progressive that nonprofit is. And so I encourage people not to work for nonprofits. And I think that's a good way to sort of sustain yourself and really get involved with grassroots level organizers. And by grassroots, I mean, not people who have multi-million-dollar budgets, but people who are sort of outside those spaces and, and work at Kroger. And, I saw an interview with Boots Riley recently, and he talked about this, and he had a great analogy. And he said, like, if I'm a musician, the worst thing I can do is go work for like a corporate jingle factory, because it's going to influence the music I make, and my music's going to become very watered down. And so that's what happens to people who want to get involved in this work when they go work for nonprofits, is their work sort of becomes co-opted and sort of is sort of, like controlled by whatever philanthropic organization is funding that nonprofit. So the motto that I have about that, and it's not my motto, but it comes from like a lot of radical Black freedom organizers, is stay low and build. And as long as I'm staying close to the ground and trying to build something in solidarity with the people that I work with, I always sort of, I never really get discouraged in that work because I'm always sustained by it.
Can I just jump in here real quick here? So Josh, I love so much of what you're saying. And I really want to push back on what you're saying around performative wokeness, because I think that it's incredibly important for us to think as organizers about how we're trying to build power and bring people in. And I get you, and you focusing on organizing in poor white communities, or that being a critical strategic point, that's awesome. And Marx and Engels were not working class. A lot of folks, who were coming from, who were building union, doing different kinds of work. So cross-class solidarity, I believe, is possible. It's not my primary focus, but to say right now, as millions of white people are engaging in Black liberation struggle in historic levels, I think it is actually a profound mistake for people who are on the left, who are anti-racist already, to be judgmental and critical of how white people are getting involved in this moment, as opposed to, yeah, you could be critical, but then we have a responsibility to organize people into the movement rather than put up barriers and critique their work, because white supremacy wants to keep us small. White supremacy wants to keep white people not engaged. And so when white people first show up, they're not going to know how to do it all right. They might do it performative. They might make a mistake. But I think it's our responsibility to help people do this work. And that if we just dismiss people as like, you're performing wokeness, that we're actively making our movement smaller and making our movement less effective. So build power in the ways you want to, but I would just be very careful about how we are critical of people coming in rather than helping build power by bringing them in.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think time will tell with most of that stuff. It'll kind of work itself out.
Time will tell, but it's our responsibility. Like if we just say,
yeah,
time will tell. Like if we have the attitude of where are they going to still be here then? It's like we're playing the game Survivor and we're going to wait to see who's still around. I'm not on the island to see who's still going to be here. I'm about trying to build a movement that actively supports people to participate, knowing there's low times and high times. If we're judgmental of how people participate, as opposed to analyzing how people participate and how can we maximize their impact, how can we maximize their involvement, I don't want to be a part of a club of really cool white anti-racist organizers that watch all the other people and judge them. I want to be a part of organizers that are trying to actively support millions of everyday people to be a part of movements for liberation, because I don't want to be a savior. I don't want to be an ally. I want to get free.
Yeah, I think even an opportunist adds to the number for the president. So if you fall off later, you know.
I wasn't trying to be judgmental, just it's a historical analysis to sort of, admit that the bourgeoisie, it's not in the interest of the bourgeoisie to engage in anti-capitalist action. And that's all I was really trying to say.
I'm with you, but I don't believe the middle class is the bourgeoisie. I believe the middle class is the movable middle that needs to be united with working class and poor folks to overthrow ruling class power.
All right, thank you all. Thank you all. This is a great discussion. Thank you for everyone who has tuned in today. Erica Denise always ends an Unscripted with this question that I would love to go around and have everyone answer. And it is, oh, I just lost track of it. It is, what do you know for sure?
I know something for sure. I know if you look at your friends list on Facebook and you see one of those people, like someone said before, who went from kind of passive, like let's just all be nice, to being radicalized in this moment, if you call them and get one of the things that Jess mentioned, one of the multiple ways to be involved, and say, hey, I'm doing this thing on this date, want to do it with me? If you do 2 of those calls, I bet you one person will join you. So I know for sure conversations change hearts.
I'll go next. This kind of also pertains to the previous question, but yeah, which the previous question had been, if you're new to this and you're afraid of making mistakes and saying or doing the wrong thing, and that's preventing you from wanting to take action. I know for sure that for us as white people, if we act and try to do something in support of anti-racist action, and we make a mistake and we slip up and it's embarrassing to us because we got called out or because we got corrected, the stakes for us are a hell of a lot lower than the stakes are for not acting for that reason. So, okay, I get embarrassed. Maybe somebody is not my friend anymore. Maybe someone's judging me. That sucks. That's unfortunate. No one wants that to happen to them. But in me choosing to stay silent or complicit or not take action, that's multiple opportunities that are missed to help end white supremacy, and that those opportunities now are going to turn into a lot of consequences for Black people who are, daily being crushed by these systems. So that's what I know for sure.
Okay, I'll go next. I know for sure that I'm never going to be able to appease everyone. And if I don't build a system for myself, somebody else will build it for me. So I have to build a system for how I'm going to act. I have to be committed to evolving. And if I continue to do that, then I'll always find myself on the right side of justice.
Shout out to Oprah for formulating this question of what do I know for sure. I've been sitting here like silently blushing because I'm like, I don't know anything, but I actually think that's part of it too. Just this sense of, yeah, I guess one thing I know for sure is that I don't know anything for sure, right? And so it's always going to be learning from people who are most directly impacted by whatever issues or systems I want to take apart. And yes, just always being open to that learning and following marching orders when they come down, and knowing that I don't know, like being a Southerner, and many generations of Southerners, so you can fill in the blanks there. You know, I inherited white supremacy. I inherited the legacy of my family, and I can't do anything about that. But what I do have, and I'm sort of borrowing some phrasing from a writer named Janae Woods, you know, I can't make choices about what I inherited. I have a choice to make about what my legacy is going to be, what I'm going to leave behind for the next generation to inherit. And so that's where I'm really trying to focus, instead of getting all tied up in like white guilt and a bunch of other stuff that is very natural to feel, but doesn't actually, I think, to go back to things Josh was saying at the top, you know, feeling guilty doesn't really change the material conditions for people of color in this country, right? So what do you do to sort of say, like, yes, this is how I feel, and now here's what I'm going to do.
All right, anyone else before we close out? All right, thank you everyone. And also a reminder that we are partnering with Roots 101, African American Museum. I see Lamont in the chat. So if you are able to donate today, please do. Excited to be part of that museum opening. And thanks everyone for being here. I really appreciate you having this conversation live, transparently. Thank you so much.
Thanks, y'all. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for moderating us.